The mountains of central Japan rose like the spines of sleeping dragons against the bruised purple of a winter dawn, their peaks crowned with snow that gleamed pink in the first light, while below, in the valleys, the morning mist clung to the rice paddies like the ghosts of 10,000 battles yet to come. It was the 15th year of the Tenbun era, what the Western calendar would mark as 1546, and the land that would one day be called Japan was not yet a unified nation but a patchwork of warring provinces, each ruled by a daimyo whose ambitions extended exactly as far as his army could march, and whose power rested entirely upon the strength of the mounted samurai, who formed the aristocratic warrior class that had dominated Japanese warfare for centuries. In a modest castle town in Mikawa province, in a compound where the morning braziers had just been lit and the smell of cooking rice drifted through wooden corridors, a young samurai named Matsudaira Hirotada stood in his armor facing the rising sun and contemplated the nature of warfare and whether everything his father had taught him about honor and combat was about to become obsolete. Hirotada was 23 years old, lord of a minor domain wedged uncomfortably between the territories of the powerful Imagawa clan to the east and the aggressive Oda clan to the west, and he had recently observed something during a border skirmish that troubled him deeply enough that he had not slept properly in 3 nights. His army, like every respectable daimyo's force, was built around mounted samurai, warriors who had trained since childhood in the arts of horsemanship and archery, men whose families had served his family for generations, bound by oaths of loyalty that were supposed to be stronger than steel and more enduring than stone. These mounted warriors were the heart of any army, the decisive force that would charge into enemy formations, scatter foot soldiers like chaff before wind, and bring glory to their lord through individual feats of martial prowess that would be sung about by court poets and recorded in family chronicles. Supporting these elite horsemen were the ashigaru, a term that literally meant light feet, the peasant foot soldiers who were conscripted from villages during campaign season, given simple armor if they were lucky, and nothing but a straw hat if they were not, handed spears or bows, and told to stand in formation and try not to run away when the real fighting started. The ashigaru were considered barely one step above farmers with sharp sticks, useful for occupying ground and making an army look larger, but not expected to actually decide the outcome of battles. But 3 nights ago, Hirotada had watched a unit of enemy ashigaru armed with unusually long spears hold their ground against a cavalry charge that should have scattered them like leaves in autumn wind. The horsemen had thundered forward with all the confidence of warriors who had never met an obstacle their momentum could not overcome, and the peasant spearmen had simply stood in their ranks, their weapons leveled, and when the horses came within striking range, those spears, each one perhaps 7 or 8 meters long, had reached out like the fingers of some terrible giant and stopped the charge dead. Horses impaled themselves on the pike points. Riders were unhorsed and trampled. The cavalry unit had been forced to withdraw, and the ashigaru formation had not broken, had not even wavered, had simply stood there like a wall of wood and iron and peasant stubbornness. And Hirotada had realized in that moment that he was watching something that might change everything about how wars were fought in this fractured country. The thought had been troubling him ever since, because if peasants with long spears could stop mounted samurai, Then what did that mean for the entire social and military order upon which his world was built? The social structure of 16th century Japan was as rigid as the steel of a samurai's katana, and as carefully maintained as a Zen garden. At the top were the daimyo, the feudal lords who ruled provinces and commanded armies. Below them were the samurai, the warrior aristocracy who owned land, bore family names, and had the legal right to carry two swords as symbols of their status. And at the bottom, far below in the social hierarchy, were the farmers, artisans, and merchants, the common people who produced the rice and goods that sustained the entire system, but who were not permitted to own weapons or practice martial arts except under the direct command of their lords. The ashigaru existed in a strange middle space. Peasants who were temporarily elevated to military service, but who would return to their fields when the campaign season ended, who were given weapons but not respect, who were expected to die for their lords if necessary, but who would never be honored as warriors in the same way that samurai were honored. This system had functioned for generations because it reflected what everyone understood to be the natural order of things. Samurai were warriors by birth, by training, by divine right according to some. Peasants were not, and teaching a peasant to hold a spear did not make him a warrior any more than giving a crow a hawk's feathers would make it a bird of prey. But necessity is the mother of transformation, and the Sengoku period was nothing if not an age of necessity. The Onin War that had begun in 1467 had shattered the authority of the Ashikaga shogunate, plunging Japan into a century-long era of near-constant warfare that would later be called the Warring States period. Daimyo fought daimyo for control of provinces, for access to trade routes, for the prestige of holding the capital, for survival itself. Armies grew larger because each lord needed enough troops to defend his borders, while simultaneously fielding forces to attack his neighbors. But there was a problem with fielding larger armies built around mounted samurai. There simply were not enough samurai. The warrior class was limited by heredity, by the number of families who had the wealth to maintain horses and armor and weapons, by the years of training required to produce a competent mounted archer. A daimyo might have a few hundred samurai sworn to his service, perhaps 1,000 if he was particularly powerful or had managed to attract masterless ronin to his banner. But to field an army of 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 men, which was increasingly necessary in the massive campaigns of the mid-16th century, he needed ashigaru, lots of them. Peasants pulled from the rice fields and given whatever weapons could be mass-produced cheaply, and taught whatever tactics could be learned quickly. The traditional ashigaru carried spears that were perhaps 3 or 4 meters long, adequate for defending a position but not particularly effective against charging cavalry. A mounted samurai had reach, elevation, momentum, and years of training. An ashigaru with a short spear had fear, poor equipment, and maybe a few weeks of basic drilling if he was fortunate. The outcome of such encounters was predictable, which was why battles were still being decided primarily by the actions of the samurai class, with the ashigaru serving mainly as numerical padding and as targets to absorb enemy arrows. But someone, and history does not record exactly who or when, had the revolutionary idea of making the spears longer. Much longer. If a standard spear was 3 meters, what if you made it 6 meters? What if you made it 8 meters? What if you made it so long that a mounted samurai's weapon could not reach the men holding it, so long that horses would refuse to charge into the forest of points, so long that the advantage of being on horseback was negated by the simple geometry of reach. The nagai yari, the extra-long spear, began appearing in Japanese armies sometime in the early 16th century, though the exact origins are lost to the chaos of the period. These were not elegant weapons. They were crude, functional, mass-producible. A straight wooden shaft, sometimes reinforced with metal bands, topped with a simple iron or steel blade. They were heavy, unwieldy, impossible to use effectively by a single warrior fighting alone. But that was the point. These weapons were not designed for individual combat. They were designed for formation fighting, for units of men standing shoulder to shoulder, their pikes leveled, creating a hedgehog of steel points that extended meters beyond their front rank. A formation of nagai yari armed ashigaru was not a collection of individual warriors. It was a single organism, a weapon system, and its effectiveness depended not on the skill of any individual spearman, but on the discipline of the formation as a whole. Training a shigaru to use these weapons was a challenge unlike anything samurai instructors had faced before. Samurai warfare was built on individual excellence, on years of practice with the bow and sword, on developing the physical conditioning and mental discipline to perform in single combat. But you could not train a peasant farmer to be a samurai in a few weeks, and the daimyo who were expanding their armies did not have years to wait. What they could do, what they had to do, was teach these men to act as a unit. The individual did not matter. What mattered was the formation. Stand in your position. Keep your pike level. Do not break ranks. Do not advance without orders. Do not retreat without orders. Trust the man to your left and the man to your right, because your life depends on them maintaining their position just as their lives depend on you maintaining yours. It was a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare, one that prioritized collective discipline over individual heroism, and it worked. The drilling was brutal and repetitive. Hour after hour, day after day, ashigaru recruits would stand in formation holding their pikes, learning to brace the butt of the shaft against the ground or against their hip, learning to angle the point at precisely the right height to catch a charging horse in the chest, learning to maintain their spacing so that the forest of pike points remained dense and impenetrable. They learned to march in formation without breaking ranks, to pivot as a unit, to present their pikes in different directions in response to shouted commands. They learned that if they broke formation and ran, they would die, because an isolated ashigaru was easy prey for a mounted samurai. But if they stood together, maintained their line, kept their pikes level, they were almost invulnerable to cavalry charges. The psychological conditioning was as important as the physical training. Peasants had spent their entire lives bowing to samurai, treating the warrior class with a deference that bordered on religious awe. Now they were being told that they could kill samurai, that their crude weapons wielded collectively were more powerful than the finest blade in the hands of a noble warrior. It was a revolutionary concept, and it spread through the ashigaru ranks with the kind of electricity that comes when the oppressed realize they are not as powerless as they thought. By the middle of the 16th century, the military landscape of Japan was changing rapidly. Daimyo who adopted the new pike tactics found their armies becoming more effective, able to hold defensive positions against superior cavalry, able to contest ground that would have been impossible to hold with traditional Ashigaru formations. Other lords took notice and began reorganizing their own forces. Samurai commanders who had spent their careers perfecting cavalry tactics found themselves forced to adapt or become obsolete. Some resisted fiercely, arguing that mass formations of peasant spearmen were dishonorable, that true warfare was decided by the courage and skill of individual warriors, that reducing battle to the mechanical coordination of formations was beneath the dignity of the samurai class. But honor does not stop a pike, and dignity does not win wars, and the daimyo, who prioritized effectiveness over tradition, began accumulating victories that could not be dismissed. The transformation was not uniform or immediate. Different regions adopted the new tactics at different rates. Conservative domains clung to traditional methods longer, while innovative lords like Oda Nobunaga embraced any tactic that gave them an advantage, regardless of how it offended traditional sensibilities. The result was a period of extreme tactical diversity, where armies using very different doctrines would meet on the battlefield, and the outcomes would provide brutal, immediate feedback about what worked and what did not. An army built around mounted samurai charging into a prepared pike formation would suffer devastating casualties. An army of pike-armed Ashigaru, caught in the open by cavalry before they could form up, would be slaughtered. Victory increasingly went to the commanders, who understood how to use their forces appropriately, who could read terrain and weather and enemy dispositions and deploy their troops in the manner most suited to the circumstances. One battle that exemplified the new warfare occurred in the territory disputes between the Takeda and Uesugi clans, two of the most powerful military houses of the period, whose rivalry would produce some of the largest and most tactically sophisticated battles of the Sengoku era. At a place where three rivers converged and the ground was flat and open, perfect cavalry country according to traditional military wisdom, a Uesugi force built around pike-armed Ashigaru formations established a defensive position. The Takeda commander, confident in his cavalry's ability to break any infantry formation, ordered a frontal assault. His horsemen were the best in Japan, trained and equipped to the highest standards, riding the sturdy Kiso horses that were the finest war mounts the islands could produce. They had broken Uesugi formations before. They expected to break them again. They charged across the open ground with the sun behind them, a river of steel and horseflesh that should have been unstoppable. And they struck the Uesugi pike formation like an ocean wave hitting a cliff of stone and steel. The front rank of the Uesugi Ashigaru had braced their pikes, the butts planted firmly in the earth, the shafts angled upward at 45 degrees, creating a sloped wall of pike points that extended 8 meters in front of their position. Behind them, second and third ranks held their pikes at slightly higher angles, creating layers of steel that meant even if the first rank's weapons were somehow pushed aside or broken, there were more pike points immediately behind. The Takeda cavalry, committed to their charge and unable to stop even if they had wanted to, impacted the pike wall with catastrophic results. Horses impaled themselves on multiple pike points simultaneously, the momentum of their charge driving the steel deep into their chests and necks. Riders were thrown from their mounts, crashing to the ground, where they were immediately set upon by Ashigaru, with shorter weapons who swarmed forward to dispatch them. The few horses that managed to avoid the pikes found themselves unable to penetrate the formation, as the density of the pikes and the men holding them created a physical barrier that no amount of courage or training could overcome. The charge broke like water against stone, and the survivors fell back in disorder, leaving dozens of dead and dying horses and riders on the ground before the Wesugi formation, which had not moved, had not wavered, had simply stood in place and let physics and geometry do the work. The psychological impact of this and similar engagements rippled through the samurai class like an earthquake. For centuries, the mounted warrior had been the apex predator of the Japanese battlefield, the ultimate expression of martial prowess, the living embodiment of the warrior ideal. Samurai children grew up hearing stories of famous cavalry charges, of individual warriors who had won glory through mounted combat, of the honor that came from defeating enemies while seated on a horse. And now, peasants with long sticks were making cavalry charges suicidal. The social implications were staggering. If a peasant conscript with a few weeks of training could kill a samurai who had trained his entire life, what did that say about the supposed superiority of the warrior class? If battles were being decided by the discipline of formations rather than the courage of individuals, what happened to the entire honor system that was supposed to justify samurai privilege? These questions troubled conservative elements of the warrior class deeply, but they troubled the peasant Ashigaru not at all, because the Ashigaru were discovering for the first time that they were not helpless, that they could defend themselves, that their lord's power over them was not absolute and unchallengeable. The daimyo themselves were of divided minds about the transformation. On one hand, pike formations made their armies more effective, which was essential for survival in the brutal competition of the Sengoku period. On the other hand, an army of empowered, organized peasants who had learned they could kill samurai was potentially dangerous to the social order that kept the daimyo in power. The solution that most lords adopted was to professionalize the Ashigaru, to turn them from temporary conscripts into permanent soldiers who were paid and equipped by the domain, who trained year-round rather than just during campaign season, who were given better armor and weapons and even granted minor privileges that elevated them slightly above common peasants, while keeping them firmly below the samurai class. This created a new military class, not quite samurai, but no longer simple peasants either. Soldiers whose loyalty was to their lord and whose social position depended on maintaining the military order that gave them status. It was a careful balancing act, and different domains managed it with varying degrees of success. But the overall trend was clear. The Ashigaru were here to stay, and they were transforming from expendable fodder into the backbone of Japanese armies. The tactics continued to evolve as commanders experimented with different formations and combinations of troop types. Pure pike formations were strong but inflexible, excellent for holding a position but vulnerable if flanked or attacked from multiple directions. The solution was combined arms tactics, mixing pike-armed Ashigaru with other unit types to cover their weaknesses. Shorter armed infantry with swords and smaller spears would protect the pike formation's flanks. Archers would weaken enemy formations before they closed to melee range. Cavalry was not abandoned but repurposed, used for flanking attacks, pursuit of broken enemies, and charges against enemy units that were already engaged and could not reform to receive a charge. The samurai class, facing the obsolescence of their traditional role as shock cavalry, adapted by taking command positions, by leading combined arms units, by developing new tactical doctrines that incorporated pike formations as central elements rather than treating them as auxiliaries. It was a painful adaptation for many, this transition from being the tip of the spear to being the commanders directing where the spear struck. But it was necessary for survival both as individuals and as a class. The most innovative commanders began to see warfare as something like a game of Go, where victory came from controlling space and forcing the enemy into unfavorable positions rather than from direct confrontation. Pike formations excelled at controlling space, at denying ground to the enemy, at creating zones that cavalry could not enter. A skilled commander could use multiple pike formations like chess pieces, positioning them to restrict enemy movement, channeling enemy forces into killing zones, creating situations where the enemy had no good options. This was warfare as system and strategy rather than as spectacle and individual heroism, and it rewarded intelligence and planning over raw courage. The commanders who mastered this new style of warfare, men like Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu, would go on to unify Japan and reshape the nation's political structure, while those who clung to the old ways would find themselves increasingly marginalized or destroyed. The Weatheron campaign could make the difference between victory and defeat in ways that had not been as critical in the age of mounted warfare. Pike formations required solid footing. Muddy ground from heavy rain could make it impossible for Ashigaru to maintain their formations, as the weight of the long pikes and the need to brace them properly meant they needed stable ground beneath their feet. A clever commander facing a pike-heavy army would try to force battle after rain, or on marshy ground, or anywhere that the terrain would disadvantage the unwieldy long spears. Conversely, a commander with strong pike formations would seek high ground and solid earth, would try to force the enemy to attack uphill into prepared positions, would use rivers and streams to protect flanks, and limit the directions from which his formations could be attacked. Reading terrain became more critical than ever, and the generals who understood topography as well as they understood tactics gained significant advantages. The sound of battle changed during this period in ways that veterans of the earlier era found disorienting. Traditional samurai warfare had been loud, but in specific ways. The thunder of hoofbeats, the twang of bowstrings, the clash of swords, the shouts of individual warriors calling out their names and lineages before engaging in combat. Pike warfare was different. It was the rhythmic chanting of formation commanders calling cadences, the creaking of hundreds of wooden pike shafts bending under stress, the terrible screams of horses impaling themselves on pike points, the sound more of a grinding mechanical process than of individual combat. There was less glory in it, less opportunity for individual distinction, but there was a kind of terrible efficiency that previous generations had not achieved. Battles could be decided more quickly, with more decisive results, though not necessarily with fewer casualties. In fact, the casualties in major engagements often increased as armies grew larger and tactics grew more effective at inflicting losses on massed formations. The code of Bushido, the way of the warrior that was supposed to guide samurai behavior, came under severe strain during this period. Traditional Bushido emphasized loyalty, honor, individual combat prowess, and death before dishonor. But what did honor mean in an age where battles were won by peasant formations rather than samurai duels? What did individual prowess matter when victory depended on maintaining formation discipline rather than seeking out worthy opponents? Some samurai adapted by reinterpreting Bushido to emphasize loyalty and duty over personal glory, becoming commanders and administrators who took pride in serving their lords effectively, even if that meant coordinating peasant soldiers rather than engaging in personal combat. Others could not make the transition and became increasingly bitter and nostalgic for an imagined golden age when warfare was more pure and honor had clear meaning. A few became ronin, masterless samurai, who wandered the country selling their services as mercenaries or bodyguards, refusing to adapt to the new military realities and clinging to traditional methods even as those methods became obsolete. The villages that supplied the ashigaru began to change as well. Young men who had served as pikemen would return to their farms with military training, with discipline, with an understanding that they were not as powerless as the social order claimed they were. Some of these men became the seeds of later peasant uprisings when their lords raised taxes too high or treated them too harshly. The lords understood this danger and responded by trying to maintain tighter control over weapons, implementing laws that forbade peasants from owning or training with weapons outside of official military service, trying to ensure that the empowerment of the ashigaru remained channeled and controlled. But the knowledge, once gained, could not be erased. The peasants had learned they could fight, and that knowledge would echo through Japanese history for generations. The religious dimension of warfare shifted as well during this period. Buddhist monasteries had maintained their own military forces for centuries. Warrior monks who fought to protect temple lands and defend Buddhist interests in the complex political landscape of medieval Japan. These monastery forces had traditionally relied heavily on the martial prowess of individual warrior monks, and they found themselves at a disadvantage against the new pike-based armies. Several major monasteries were destroyed during the Sengoku period by daimyo, whose armies could simply overwhelm the monastery defenders through superior numbers and tactics. The most famous example was Oda Nobunaga's attack on the Enryakuji Monastery on Mount Hiei, where Nobunaga's forces, including large numbers of ashigaru, massacred thousands of monks and destroyed buildings that had stood for centuries. The traditional warrior monks, skilled in individual combat but unable to form effective pike formations, were swept away by armies that prioritized tactical efficiency over individual prowess. This was seen by many as evidence that the gods themselves had abandoned the old ways, that heaven favored the new methods of warfare, though others interpreted it as evidence that the new methods were inherently dishonorable, and that those who used them would eventually face divine punishment. The economic implications of the military transformation were significant. Maintaining a large force of pike-armed ashigaru required substantial resources. The pikes themselves, while simpler than samurai weapons, still had to be manufactured and maintained. The armor, even the simple versions given to ashigaru, required iron and leather and labor. The soldiers needed to be fed, and while campaign season had traditionally been timed to avoid interfering with agricultural work, the increasing scale and duration of wars meant that soldiers were being kept under arms for longer periods, pulling them away from productive labor. The daimyo responded by improving their tax collection systems, by encouraging trade to generate revenue, by looking for any source of wealth that could be converted into military power. This led to the rise of merchant classes in castle towns, to the development of more sophisticated monetary economies, to changes in how rice production was organized and taxed. The military revolution was driving an economic revolution, and both were driving social changes that would reshape Japan profoundly. The education of young samurai changed to reflect the new military realities. Traditional samurai education had focused on horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and the classical texts of Chinese military theory. Now there was increased emphasis on formations, on logistics, on the coordination of combined arms, on the mathematics of troop positioning and movement. Young samurai who aspired to command positions needed to understand how pike formations worked, how to support them with other troop types, how to counter enemy pike formations, how to read terrain and weather. The romantic ideal of the lone warrior defeating enemies through personal valor was giving way to the professional ideal of the competent officer managing complex military operations. Some samurai families embraced this change enthusiastically, seeing it as the future and training their sons accordingly. Others resisted, continuing to emphasize traditional training methods and hoping that the old ways would somehow return to dominance. The families that adapted well to the new environment tended to prosper and rise in status, while those that clung to tradition found themselves increasingly marginalized. The wives and daughters of samurai families also felt the changes, though their roles remained officially limited. Women of the warrior class had traditionally been expected to maintain the household while their husbands campaigned, and, in extreme situations, to defend the home if it was attacked. Some samurai women were trained in the use of the naginata, a pole weapon suitable for indoor defense, and there were legendary tales of women who had defended castles or killed enemy soldiers. But as warfare became more organized and professional, as campaigns lasted longer and involved larger forces, the role of women in the military sphere became even more restricted. They were the managers of the household economy, the educators of young children before they began formal training, the preservers of family honor and tradition. Some women wielded significant informal power through their influence on husbands and sons, and a few became effective political operators, but official military command remained entirely male. The transformation of warfare from individual heroism to organizational efficiency did nothing to change this gender dynamic, and in some ways reinforced it by emphasizing hierarchical command structures that excluded women entirely. The introduction of firearms in 1543, when Portuguese traders brought matchlock arquebuses to Japan, added another revolutionary element to the already transformed military landscape. The Tanegashima, as the Japanese called these firearms, were even more democratic than pikes in their implications. A pike required strength and formation discipline, but was still essentially a traditional close combat weapon. A gun required almost no physical strength and very little training to use adequately, and it could kill at a distance that made armor and close combat skill largely irrelevant. The combination of pike formations to stop cavalry and arquebus fire to kill from a distance created a military system where the traditional samurai skill set of horsemanship and swordsmanship was almost superfluous. The samurai class adapted by monopolizing command positions, by emphasizing their role as leaders and strategists rather than individual combatants, by redefining what it meant to be a warrior in an age where the actual fighting was increasingly done by commoners. But this adaptation was incomplete and uncomfortable, and it created tensions within the warrior class that would persist for generations. The battles of the later Sengoku period, in the 1560s through 1580s, were massive affairs involving tens of thousands of troops, complex multi-day campaigns, elaborate sieges, and tactics that would not have been recognizable to warriors from a century earlier. The Battle of Kawanakajima between the Takeda and Wasugi clans involved repeated large-scale engagements where pike formations played crucial roles. The campaigns of Oda Nobunaga featured the innovative use of combined pike and arquebus formations that made his armies nearly unstoppable. The unification wars of Toyotomi Hideyoshi showcased siege warfare, where pike-armed troops held perimeters while engineers undermined walls. These battles were won not through the valor of individual warriors, but through superior logistics, better intelligence, more effective troop coordination, and the ability to concentrate force at decisive points. The commanders who succeeded in this environment were men who could think systematically, who could manage complex operations, who could adapt to changing circumstances quickly. The age of the heroic individual warrior had not entirely ended, but it had been decisively subordinated to the age of organized professional military systems. The common foot soldiers who made up the bulk of these armies lived lives that history rarely recorded in detail. They marched long distances carrying heavy equipment, slept in camps that ranged from organized to chaotic depending on their commander's competence, ate whatever food the supply system could provide, which was often inadequate. They suffered from disease, from injuries that did not kill immediately but left them crippled, from the psychological trauma of combat and the grief of losing comrades. When they fought in formations where their individual survival depended on collective discipline, where running meant certain death and standing meant possible survival. They were not motivated by abstract concepts of honor or loyalty, but by more immediate concerns: pay, food, the social pressure of their peers, fear of punishment, and perhaps hope of reward. They sang marching songs that mocked their officers, told stories around campfires about homes and families, and imagined futures, prayed to Buddhist deities and Shinto kami for protection. They were the humans at the bottom of the grand strategic schemes, and their experiences, their suffering, their small rebellions and moments of courage were what actually determined whether those strategic schemes succeeded or failed. As the 16th century progressed toward its end, the military transformation that had begun with the adoption of long pikes continued to accelerate and compound. The arrival of European firearms added another element: the development of more sophisticated castle architecture with lower, thicker walls designed to resist cannon fire changed siege warfare. The increasing professionalization of armies meant that soldiers trained year-round rather than being seasonal conscripts. All of these changes reinforced each other, creating a military environment that was radically different from what had existed just 50 years earlier. The samurai class maintained its social status and its legal privileges, but its monopoly on military effectiveness was broken permanently. The pike-armed ashigaru had proven that organization and discipline could defeat individual prowess, that peasants could kill aristocrats, that the old social order's claim that some people were born to rule and others to obey was not endorsed by the gods of war. This was not necessarily a democratic revelation. Most of the ashigaru who learned these lessons continued to serve their lords and accept the social hierarchy. But the knowledge was there, the precedent was established, and it could not be unmade. The unification of Japan under Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the 1580s, and then under Tokugawa Ieyasu in the early 1600s, was only possible because of these military transformations. The armies that conquered and unified the country were built around pike-armed ashigaru formations, supplemented with arquebus fire and cavalry used tactically rather than as the decisive arm. The peace that the Tokugawa shogunate imposed after 1600 was enforced by the threat of these armies, by the knowledge that any daimyo who rebelled would face not honorable single combat, but overwhelming organized force. The Tokugawa deliberately worked to demilitarize society during the long peace of the Edo period, strictly controlling weapons, forbidding peasants from owning arms, trying to put the genie of peasant military empowerment back in the bottle. They had some success. Without active warfare, the specialized training that made pike formations effective was not maintained, and the knowledge gradually faded from living practice. But the precedent remained in history, and when Japan faced foreign threats in the 19th century, the memory that commoners could be effective soldiers contributed to the creation of a conscript army that would be very different from the samurai-dominated forces of earlier eras. Standing in that castle courtyard in the 1540s, watching the morning mist burn away under the rising sun, young Matsudaira Hirotada could not have foreseen all of these consequences of the transformation he had witnessed 3 nights earlier. He could not have known that his son, who would take the name Tokugawa Ieyasu, would use pike-based armies to become the supreme military leader of all Japan. He could not have known that the military revolution he was observing would enable the unification of the country and the establishment of a peace that would last more than 2 centuries. What he knew was simpler and more immediate, that warfare was changing, that the old certainties were crumbling, that the long spears in the hands of organized peasants had stopped cavalry charges that should have been unstoppable, and that anyone who wanted to survive in this new age would have to adapt or perish. The 8-meter pikes had changed everything, not through magic or divine intervention, but through the simple application of physics and organization, through the discovery that collective discipline could defeat individual excellence, through the revelation that wars were won not by heroes, but by systems. The samurai who mocked the peasant spearmen had learned their lesson in blood and defeat, and the lesson had spread through the warrior class like wildfire. The age of the pike had arrived, and with it, the world of traditional samurai warfare was passing into history, mourned by some, welcomed by others, but impossible to resurrect. The transformation was complete, though its echoes would continue for generations, in the military systems that evolved from these foundations, in the social tensions between the warrior class and the common people, in the stories that would be told about this era when Japan tore itself apart and then forged itself anew. The peasant, with his 8-meter pike, had stopped the mounted samurai's charge, and in doing so had changed not just the battlefield, but the social, political, and psychological landscape of an entire nation. History would remember the great generals and the dramatic battles, but the real revolution had been carried out by common men standing in formation, holding their ground, discovering that they were not as powerless as they had been taught. Learning that the world could be different from what tradition claimed was eternal and unchangeable. And that lesson, once learned, would never be entirely forgotten, no matter how much the powerful might wish it could be erased from memory and from possibility.